But so Australia sets up the White Australia policy, and it becomes to some extent a model for the world. And London not only sort of doesn't oppose it, but helps by finding cloaking forms of words, by finding polite ways of doing this dirty work. And it becomes very skilled at this.
Yes. You like those British?
As I remarked earlier, the British were trying to keep together a multiracial empire with the doctrine that there would be no racial discrimination. But they had to deal with these recalcitrant white societies who were determined to control who could come into their country and the manner in which they came. So what the British, the Australians left to themselves would have simply passed legislation, as they had done in several of the colonies in 1896, simply prohibiting the entry of anyone from Africa, Asia or the Pacific Islands. They were pieces of legislation passed in the Australian colonies before Federation. But the British said, no, you can't do that. This would be offensive to many of the Queen's subjects. So it was the British who said to the Australians, look, old chaps, you really have to do this with a little deal of subtlety. And so you have to do it by using a dictation test which appears to be based on education and not on race. But everyone knew that it was based on race, and in the debate in the first Federal Parliament, the dictation test was only just accepted because it was being driven by the government. And there's no doubt that, as I say, left to themselves, they would have openly discriminated against anyone who was non-European. The dictation test, as many people said in the debate, was a dishonest way to do it. Let's be open and frank and tell the world that this is to be a white country. And at the same time, there was this view that the white races were being squeezed because the sort of geographical determinism, the parts of the world that were possible for white settlement were filling up. The United States was filling up, and it was viewed by people at the time, and this was said in the debates in the Federal Parliament, that the Australian continent was the last place in the world where the white race would be able to thrive and increase. So it was seen as being not just important for Australia, but important for the white race all over the world in the coming global struggle.
It seemed to me from the book that another reason why things developed as they did in Australia is that we did live in the imperial umbrella. So that Britain had treaty obligations with China and Japan, which said, that there's to be nothing is to be done which would hinder the free movement of Chinese and Japanese, that they're free to come and go, etc., etc. Meanwhile, Australia is slamming the door. We didn't have and couldn't have treaties with Japan and China, so we kind of could scurry around like a naughty child and get away with it.
Yes, indeed. Australia could get away with it and did get away with it. And Australia was very mindful, of course, that in the end they would be protected by Britain. Militarily, in terms of the Navy, although, one of the Deacon's great obsessions was for Australia to get its own Navy, so that if Australia wanted to go it alone and could go it alone finally, it would be able to, which was one of the points of the visit of the Great White Fleet in 1908, was as an object lesson, to show Australians that they too must have a very large Navy with 16 battleships, so that they could fight their own battles now that Japan had risen as a great power. But certainly Australia played both ways with that, defying Britain but also ultimately relying on Britain.
Now, I'm giving the impression, entirely wrongly, that this book somehow stops dead at the turn of the century, but it does not. It goes right through to the 1940s, 1960s, and indeed, when was it we got rid of the dictation test in Australia?
1958.
Thanks. But also the crucial role of the First World War and of Billy Hughes. Now, we haven't got much longer because we want to take questions, but I want both panellists to please tell us how Billy Hughes caused the Pacific War in the Second World War.
To cut a long story short.
Yes, boil it down to its essence. Billy Hughes brings on the Japanese invasion.
Absolutely, Henry goes.
Like 1066 and all that.
3 minutes.
The Japanese felt that they had to, as we know, they had to become modern and progressive and become civilised. And they did this remarkably successfully, incredibly quickly, to the extent that they were able to defeat one of the great European powers in 1904-5. And the Japanese expected that this would give them equal entry into the world, give their citizens the right to travel. And they found, having done all these things, that there was still the barrier of race. And this, for quite a while, quite confused them. Why was it, when we've done all this, we've proved that we can have a modern society with, universal education, etc., 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 we are still being discriminated against in these white countries, particularly the white settler countries, California and Australia in particular. And so by the 1910s, there was a growing sense in Japan that, having pursued the desire to become a great power, they then had to take up the question of racial equality. So they decided that they would promote this idea when the League of Nations was being formed after the First World War at Versailles in 1919. And they endeavoured to have accepted a clause in the Covenant of the League recognising racial equality. Now, it had begun with Japan's desire to be accepted by the Western powers, but it became a popular movement in Japan, and it became something which all over the world was seen as something that was promoting racial equality itself. Now, for a variety of reasons, it was the Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, who played the most significant role in defeating that attempt to get racial equality recognised. And this was a very great blow to the Japanese. It was in many ways a disaster for the Japanese liberals, and indeed was one of those things that began to prepare the Japanese to the idea that international politics is not based on ideals, but is based on force, and that we will achieve equality by force, which of course what happens in the 1940s.
That just about boils that one down. Right through the book, there is the notion, there is this word thrown out, civilised, civilisation, and this is represented, this is white, always white. But then something comes along in the 1930s which destroys the inevitable confidence in white civilisation. What is the role of the Holocaust in bringing this story to a close?
Yes, I mean, that raises a lot of complex issues. It reminds me, though, to say that one of the arguments we're making is that the assertion of white policies and whiteness and exclusion doesn't come from nowhere, as it were. It's very much in response to intimations of decolonisation, of becoming emancipation, liberation of coloured and colonised peoples. That this is starting to happen in the late 19th century. So that these defensive, aggressive white policies are very much in response to stirring anti-colonial movements, in India, for example. But I think what's interesting about the Holocaust and the impact of the Holocaust is that because it happens in Europe and it happens to Europeans, it has a far greater impact. I mean, obviously, it has enormous dimensions itself, but it has a far greater impact, in a way, than what has been happening out in the New World and out in the countries on the Indian and Pacific Oceans, what has been happening to Chinese, Japanese and all the colonised peoples of the British Empire. So a whole lot of things, I think, come together by World War II to finally force things into a new era, and into an era that starts to enshrine human rights in international law. I mean, as Henry said, the first effort to do this was defeated in 1919 at Versailles, and then, you know, has some success after World War II with the enshrining of individual rights.
I was fascinated to see that the Chinese representative at Dumbarton Oaks after the Second World War was the same man as the Chinese representative after the First World War.
Absolutely.
When the attempt had failed.
Yes.
And this time it got through.
I know, it's one of those nice points of continuity which gives you a long history to that, because usually the post-World War II meetings are treated as someone else if they're in isolation too, but in fact for the Chinese delegate this is long prehistory.
Now, we'll have some questions now. I know it's a bore to get to the microphone, but the acoustics of this place means that nobody in the Remembrance Garden will be able to hear a thing anybody asks unless somebody comes to the microphone. So please do come to it, and it's there on the aisle. While I throw probably a last question, but maybe not, which is, but even after the Second World War, even after the Declaration of Human Rights, even after the revelation of the Holocaust, Australia and South Africa don't buckle.
No, you would have thought that Australia was going to continue to defend white Australia, certainly in the 1940s. I mean, one of the leading ministers in the Chifley Labor government, in responding to a suggestion, I think by a missionary, that maybe we should let in small numbers of non-Europeans, declared that the White Australia policy was being protected for the grandchildren of our grandchildren. There was very, very little sense that there would be change, certainly in the 1940s and well into the 1950s, but it was the increasing pressure from the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, and above all by the new nations, new Afro-Asian nations, that really began to put pressure on Australia. And by the early 1960s, I think most Australians realised the game was up. And they beat a very, very interesting retreat. There was no recantation, there was no declaration that this was over, but in a way they slunk away from the White Australia policy.
And in fact, it's interesting that the legislation that inaugurated the White Australia policy, of course, doesn't mention whiteness or race or anything. And therefore, in a way, the administrative regulations required to end it didn't either. So the dictation test was repealed in 1958, but, you know, who would know?
Right, at the microphone.
I haven't had the advantage of reading your book yet. Obviously.
You have, but many will.
I'm sure I shall. You spoke about the fear of colour on the part of the Australians, and yet when we look at South Australia, the 1857 legislation which gave manhood suffrage included Aboriginal men. This was not an accident, it was quite deliberate if one reads the Hansard of the time. And likewise the female suffrage legislation of 1894 gave votes not only to white women but to Aboriginal women as well. I'm sure South Australians were just as racist as people from elsewhere in the country at the time. I wonder, how does one account for this? Is it just that the Aborigines were so small in number that there was no fear of them in any way altering the homogeneity of South Australian society? And yet it does seem to run counter to the comments you've made about the fear of colour.
Okay, I'll just say something and then Henry will. Indeed, that's true about the first suffrage legislation in South Australia. One could say that South Australia is a very progressive place, which I'm sure you all agree with. But one of the points I would make is that the racial exclusions come into play in a context of nationalism. And so it's quite significant that it's in nationalist contexts and national discussions, that is, you know, towards federation or post-federation, when the self-consciousness about making it a white nation. I mean, it wasn't, white Australia has a history, you know, it's not always the same, and the development towards this absolute self-consciousness about white Australia that happens in the late 19th century in that nationalist context. But just one other thing I'll say, which we didn't mention before, vis-a-vis the Chinese. The 1881 legislation in Victoria that extends the immigration exclusion legislation also disenfranchises Chinese men. It's only men who then have the vote. It actually adds an amendment specifically to disenfranchise the Chinese. Now that's the first time that happens. Before that, Chinese colonists could all vote. So that clearly shows, you know, a movement towards, as this increasing sense of nationalism, that, you know, all others, all not whites, will be excluded.
Yes, I think one of the things that is not always appreciated is that the West generally, you know, and sort of the Anglo world and probably the whole European world was much more aware and sensitive to race in 1900 than it had been in 1850, and probably even more so in 1930 than it had been in 1880. So that when Australia, when the Federation was established, there was no doubt that Aboriginal people would be excluded from the vote, except of course where they voted in the States, and they did vote in South Australia, Tasmania, New South Wales and Victoria. But in a sense, both nationalism and racism grew stronger as the 19th century moved on.
At the microphone.
Can you say a few words on Blackberry?
What particularly about?
Well, I'd like to, I don't know whether this is what you have in your mind, but the extent to which the forced removal of the Kanakas was another world first for Australia.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point, that White Australia is not just the Immigration Restriction Act. I mean, there are several pieces of legislation that comprise White Australia in 1901, 1902, but one of the most important, and particularly symbolically, is the decision to expel Kanakas or Pacific Islanders, black labourers, to expel them from Australia. And this links to the previous question in a way. This increasing self-consciousness about wanting a racially homogeneous new nation, the new Commonwealth, it was founded in an act of racial expulsion. Now, I don't know of any other modern state at that point. You know, we've had ethnic cleansing since, but again, Australia leads the way here. It's in this modern, brave new world where it's founded in an act of racial expulsion. And I think that's highly significant.
Microphone.
Thanks very much. You made the comment that this sort of white Australia policy, this international colour line, was developed around the time that there was a sense of the sort of rising in power of the peoples of Asia and Africa and so forth, and China. And I'm just sort of wondering about, you know, in the last year or so we've been reading about the rising power of India and China, the new superpowers. The US dollar is diving right down, and you know, apparently if China sells out of US dollars, they'll be in a bad way, the Americans that is. And I'm just sort of wondering about the fact that this book has been written at this point in time. You know, it does seem to me incredibly sort of incredible chronological, you know. I mean, just perhaps you could comment on the fact that, I mean, white Australia is, for so many people overseas, just the most incredible thing about this country that many people comment on, even though, as you point out, it has sort of disappeared years ago. But that, what do you say about the state of Australian history? And in a sense, this is perhaps one of the, that this book should come out at this time.
Yes, Marr Allen, thank you for your question. Yes, well, of course, that parallel and coincidence is really striking at the moment in the last 5 years, where every time you open a newspaper, we read about Chinese power, you know, the new Chinese power, that China is to be the superpower of the 21st century. And what struck me about that is the exact echoes of what was happening in the late 19th century. That's exactly what Charles Pearson wrote about in National Life and Character, the inevitability of Chinese power. And it was that sense of the inevitability of Chinese power, that its industrial might, its commercial might, that was one of the key sort of factors driving a lot of the Australian thinking anyway in terms of white Australia, and that led countries like Australia to put up borders. You know, it was a very defensive reaction to sort of cut yourself off from the rest of the world and try and maintain the standard of living at home. Whereas today, of course, you know, there's no option, I think, but to engage with the world and to engage with Chinese power.
Yes, there's no doubt that, I think, as we've already suggested, that much of the Australian reaction was done defensively against what was presumed to be a rising tide of colour. And they took very seriously the prediction that Charles Henry Pearson had made in 1894, and in the first debate on White Australia, the second reading debate, Edmund Barton took the book into the Parliament and quoted the famous passage, "The day will come, you know, when Europe will be challenged." So they were acutely aware of this, but what they didn't know then, and what Pearson hadn't realised, that it was Japan that was suddenly, and the suddenness of Japan, I mean, the fact that Pearson had scarcely noticed Japan is an indication of just how sudden and unexpected it was, that an Asian power could challenge Europe and could catastrophically defeat the Russians. I mean, absolutely, not so much on land, but on sea, to totally destroy the Russian fleet. Now, this was an event of absolutely world-shaking importance, and it increases the concern and the fear of Australia, that knew very little about Japan, had no diplomatic relations with Japan, but greatly feared that here indeed was the beginning of the rise of Asia. It's just interesting indeed that what Pearson saw over 100 years ago with the rise of Japan has only become strikingly apparent in the last 10 years, but how extraordinary it is. And indeed, it presents Australia with the same sort of challenge. Hopefully, Australia will respond in a totally different way to the way they did to the rise of Japan.
A last question from me, because then we must stop, and both Henry and Marilyn will be signing copies of their book over the tent. And remember, of course, that no book is properly signed until you have both. A last question from me. I mean, I can never overestimate my depthless ignorance of history and the things that I think I know and find that I don't know. And reading this book, I thought this was a story that I knew. And I discovered it's a story I didn't know. That I didn't know its richness and complexity. I didn't know the way what was happening here in Australia was so entwined with what was happening in British Columbia, and California, and Natal, and London, and Washington. It had never come, and I wonder whether, as authors who have known so much more about this issue all your professional lives, also had a sense of surprise and discovery in writing the book.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, when Henry and I started to talk about doing this book, it was very much a frustration, an increasing frustration at the way that Australian history was told within such national blinkers, you know, such national boundaries, as if what happened here was totally cut off from the rest of the world. And we knew that it wasn't, and that there were lots of interconnections, but I think we hardly knew the extent and depth and richness of those intertwinings with the rest of the world. But you can't understand Australian history unless you place it in this much broader context. And it's not just about, you know, placing Australia in the world in terms of the impact of the world on Australia, but as we've been saying, the impact of Australia on the world. It's a two-way street. Yeah, and indeed, you know, you're right, it was just very exciting. Each time you looked, you discovered more and more of this connection.
Yes, we both had taught Australian history for many, many years. I had grown up when Australian history wasn't taught at all. It wasn't taught at my university. But what was taught about Australia was taught in an imperial context. Now, in a way, it was important that we broke with that tradition and that we did begin to really write and think about Australia. But I think we both found a tremendous sense of excitement at seeing the way in which you could write Australia into the world in a different way from the old imperial way, and to see Australia indeed as an important player in many of these things, that Australia was deeply involved in the great currents of 20th century history in ways that I think nationalist, history that just looks at Australia simply doesn't notice. And I think in that sense, this was what provided much of the intellectual excitement for the book, and we would very much hope will provide equal excitement to those who read the book.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Marilyn Lake.